Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew. Each week, I answer questions about movie-related topics that are sent to me from our patrons. If you have a film-related question, simply go to brynmarfilm.org, look for the Film Studies Online section, and find the Ask Andrew form. Who knows? Maybe next time I'll be answering one of your questions. Today's question comes from Jerry. He asks, can you talk about shooting on film versus shooting digitally? What are the differences from a filmmaking standpoint? What are the differences from a viewer standpoint? Well, what Jerry's talking about is the switch over the last 15 years really or so to making motion pictures using a digital photographic process instead of the traditional photographic process that the movies had been using for roughly their first 100 years of existence. This was basically photography, as most of us remember it from when we were kids, and it had been around for decades when the movies were invented, which involves a chemical emulsion that reacts to light when it is exposed and inside a camera. And it sits on a strip of flexible material, and that material gets advanced, and a new batch of chemical emulsion is in place to be exposed to light, and so on and so forth. And this was a physical process that required chemicals on the strip of film and chemicals for processing of that strip of film, and those physical chemical processes took time and had certain expenses and certain physical realities of material and size and weight and all that. And as many of us know, those of us who are old enough to have gone from writing on typewriters to writing on computers, you know that once you go from physical to digital, there are a number of advantages. And the same was true with the switch from photochemical cinematography to digital cinematography. Of course, I guess much like with computers versus typewriters, the transition was not always a smooth one, and the digital process, certainly at the beginning, tended to leave some room for improvement. There had been efforts to photograph movies digitally, certainly going back into the 90s. And these were movies that, let's just say, did not necessarily rise to the aesthetic levels of your typical big budget Hollywood fare. People were interested in the freedom that digital cinematography permitted. And this is really sort of the biggest advantage that remains today, namely the freedom that comes from not being tied to that physical photochemical process. The freedom comes really in two ways. The first is expense. The physical material of film, the physical process and materials required for developing it and shipping it because it's heavy, all of those had an expense. And those expenses added up. And when resources that had been committed to that as part of a film's budget and the film industry's sort of cost of doing business, when those were able to be removed, not just for production and shooting films digitally, but later on for exhibiting them digitally, meaning no film prints had to be shipped to theaters, there was a huge savings there and huge savings of money. Now, this may sound like, well, that helps the studios, but how does it help filmmakers? It does help filmmakers, and in turn helps audiences, because the cost of making a film comes down and the cost of distributing a film comes down. And so that means, though it may not always seem the case, that producers and production companies and studios can take chances on movies, meaning spend money on movies that they wouldn't do otherwise necessarily, because the expense is lower, so they can take a greater risk. This has led to a tremendous increase in the number of movies, and for that matter, television shows that have been made over the last decade and beyond. And while we could have a debate, and I think it's for another day, over whether more means better or more means more that is better, at the very least we could agree there is more. And that has to do certainly at its core with the decreased cost of production associated with digital cinematography. Now, it also affects the efficiency of the filmmaking process. And it really does this in two ways. When movies were shot using film, the motion picture camera could only hold so much raw film stock, meaning that there was a limit to how long you could shoot until you had to stop and reload, which meant at least a minor break in the action, assuming everything went smoothly, and in some cases a more substantial one. With the way digital filming works today, and the size and speed of computers and the memory and the small amount of physical space in which a large amount of data can be captured, with digital photography, filming can go on for much longer and be a much smoother process. Now, there may, on the other hand, be some inefficiencies in this. If you think about yourself, I'll talk about me and my camera. I have a lot of pictures on my phone that are not good ones, and are things that I should delete and would delete, and are blurry or what have you, because when I see something I want to take a picture of, I just start snapping, and I keep snapping and snapping because there's no real sort of cost in money or time or physical space or anything to taking as many pictures as I want. Now, while this isn't exactly the same thing when you're shooting a motion picture, because there's a crew and there are lights and there are actors, and your time isn't necessarily just your own, that's not the same thing doesn't happen, but there's a bit more of a tendency, or the potential for a tendency toward that, than there is toward when there was motion picture film and things had a cost and a physical sort of process was required, and so on and so forth. The other way it sort of affects the filmmaking process, and this isn't so much true anymore, but it was certainly true up until fairly recently, namely that the quality of an image captured on motion picture film was better than an image that could be captured digitally. Now, this is no longer the case. The images still are to an extent different, but it's a relatively small extent. But for a time, for a number of years, you couldn't capture really true dark rich blacks, for example, or certain types of movement or patterns were problematic, and things like this with digital photography. Again, this is no longer the case, and it has the added benefit from a filmmaker's point of view that you can see how the shot will look immediately after you capture the shot. You don't have to wait for the film to be developed and wait a day or two to then see that film run back to you in a screening room to see exactly how the shots you captured look. You can see them then and there. And so that's, for a long time, seemed to be a trade-off filmmakers are willing to make, and now it's not really a trade-off they have to make at all. They still get to see things immediately, and the image quality of digital filmmaking is really excellent. That being said, there are still differences, and the best analogy I can make, and this is really, I think, the biggest thing for viewers, there are differences between watching a film that was shot digitally and a film that was shot on film stock, and it's kind of the difference between listening to a song on your iPhone versus listening to a song on a record. And some people would say that the difference there is any imperfections related to the physical nature of the more analog process are removed, and that's a good thing. Not everyone thinks that's a good thing. I would also say it's a little different in movies, and maybe the analogy extends further to music, and I just don't know enough about music. But when you watch a film, you can certainly tell when a film is being exhibited, shown to you digitally in a theater. But it's getting harder, but an eagle-eyed viewer can probably tell when the film was shot digitally too. And there seems to be just not quite as much depth or texture to the image. Again, it's very close, much closer than it used to be. And I think for most viewers, they probably can't tell a difference, except they notice that there are none of the potential physical sort of slight imperfections that might happen with motion picture film. But I guess I'm a nerd or a purist or something. I still prefer motion picture film stock, the way that looks, and I'm not alone. Quentin Tarantino does, Christopher Nolan does, but they're in the minority. The freedom of time and space and money budget that digital filmmaking affords has been embraced by the vast majority of filmmakers working today. And in part, I think that's because the exhibition process went completely digital at most movie theaters. Not at Bryn Mawr Film Institute. We still have traditional film projectors, and we still show film prints, 35 millimeter film prints when we can. But by and large, most movies are shown digitally, so shooting them digitally isn't as much of a departure as it would have been at one time. So I hope that answers the question a little bit. There's a lot more to talk about. It would be good to see what cinematographers have to say, particularly very seasoned ones who've worked a lot with both sorts of formats or technologies. But that's at least a beginning of an answer to the question. If you have your own question about the movies, please visit brynmarfilm.org, go to the Film Studies Online section, and use the Ask Andrew form to send it in. Maybe I'll answer it next week. And if you like what we're doing at Bryn Mawr Film Institute, we've got a bunch of movies and education offerings and fun things and streaming suggestions in Theater 5 at brynmarfilm.org. So please check those out. And if you think they're great, consider becoming a member or streaming a movie or making a donation. Any of those forms of support we would greatly appreciate. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.